Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me here. Yeah, well, welcome. We're going to kind of get the program going. My name is Matt Lindstrom, Director of the McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement and the Ed Henry Professor of Political Science. I'm delighted to be joined here today with some of my colleagues from the Political Science Department, the Joe Ferry Professor of Political Science, Dr. Christi Siver, as well as Dr. Pedro dos Santos. So they'll be kind of facilitating the conversation today with our distinguished guests. Valentín Sierra, many of you have heard about him already, as well as His Excellency, President Juan Manuel Santos. So without further ado, we kind of want to get things going. I know students may have some classes to go to. We're on 1:30, 1:35, so if you need to leave, just leave. We may go a little bit over 1:30, but not too much over. So yeah, that's it. So yeah, welcome. So if you could, panelists, you kind of head up.
So I think, yeah, we're going to take our seats up here.
And then
should I start first?
Yeah.
All right, thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Professor Santos, for being here. First thing to say is rock chalk. I'm also a KU rock grad. So very excited about a joke that half of my half-life in the United States was in Kansas, so Chiefs and rock chalk. So we want to get this going so we can get some questions from the crowd as well. And Chris and I were talking, I'm doing the comparative politics question, and she's doing the international relations question. So in your talk last night, you mentioned the three pillars to get to peace, the peace accord, right? And the third pillar was support of neighboring countries. So this is a two-pronged question that I have for you. First, how important do you see the support to ensure peace durability, peace stability as we move on, right? As we're having issues right now with the discussion beyond your achievements. And the second one, very specific also, with the Venezuelan crisis, how has the crisis influenced this third pillar of neighboring countries' support?
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you again, most of you. And I've had my son and I have had a wonderful time, 24 hours here at this great university. I've learned a lot, and we'll make the effort to come back as soon as possible. How does the region impact the implementation of the peace process? And that's a good question, because we're having that discussion right now. There's always, in every peace process, a percentage of the people in arms who for some reason or another don't give up their arms. The average percentage is between 13 and 15%. That's the average of all the peace processes that have been negotiated. In the case of Colombia, it was less than 8%. And some of them have gone back, and especially two important persons who were at the high-level commanders that went out of the process and went to Venezuela. They said that they went because the government was not complying with the agreement. But in good faith, I must say that that is not totally true. They both went because they were afraid that they are being accused by the US courts of committing crimes after the signature of the agreement, so they would not benefit from any of the legal benefits that the other members of the FARC would have. Now, what is important in a peace process and the condition of having the support of the region is mainly in the peace-making process. In the other face, the peace building aspect, that's more of an internal effort. It's more of what you do with the people who suffered so much in the regions because of the war, what you do with the victims, how you treat the victims, and a process of healing the wounds. And there, the outside support is not as important. So what we needed, in a way, we got. And of course, it's, if you have a hostile government like we have right now with Venezuela, some of the dissidents can go there and say that the peace process is not working and do their propaganda and even continue their violent actions with a sanctuary that in this case would be Venezuela. That in a way make it more difficult, the implementation, but that is not fundamental or crucial. Now, how does Venezuela affect the peace process and Colombia? It affects us a lot. We are the most affected by the Venezuelan crisis besides the Venezuelans themselves. The migration towards Colombia has been increasing for 3-4 years already. I took the decision to open our hearts and our arms to the Venezuelans that wanted to come to Colombia because I owed, as a Colombian, an enormous debt of gratitude to the Venezuelans who opened their arms and their hearts when Colombians were in trouble. But now it is getting to a point where it's difficult to administer that migration. We have right now, I would say, over 2 million Venezuelans. That's more migrants than the whole of Europe have received, much more from Syria. And the migrants from Syria caused a tremendous political turmoil in Europe, a much richer region than Colombia. And we have received 4 times what Europe as a whole has received from Syria, and we're still in safe territory. But we need to administer that very intelligently. I did a big effort to try to avoid xenophobia. We have been so far successful, but we are starting to see movements of xenophobia in some parts of Colombia. It's difficult to avoid. When Venezuelans, they offer their jobs, very good Venezuelans, professionals, at 1/3 or 1/4 the salary that a Colombian is paid, many entrepreneurs say, okay, come here, work for me, and tell the Colombians, well, I'm sorry, you don't have a job. And that has an effect. But I am confident that the situation will be fixed. I don't know how long. I am sorry to say that I don't think that before the U.S. elections a negotiated peaceful transition will be possible. There are too many local electoral interests to facilitate a peaceful transition, but maybe after the elections that would be possible. I think it's not difficult to achieve. And there, Colombia will have a tremendous opportunity. Venezuela is still a very rich country. Venezuela still has the biggest oil reserves of the world, more than Saudi Arabia. And when this country is reconstructed, because it's been destroyed, in that reconstruction, Colombia will be the first beneficiary. So that's why when I tell many of Colombians, have patience, treat the Venezuelans correctly. They deserve respect, and they will be grateful to every Colombian if when the time comes. That's why I told President Trump and Vice President Pence, the first visit that Vice President Pence did to Latin America was to Colombia, to Cartagena, the same day that Trump mentioned in Miami the possibility of a military intervention. And I said to the Vice President, Mr. Vice President, you and I are going to go out and we're going to make a press conference, and I will tell you, in front of all the international press, that the worst of all positive alternatives is a military intervention in Venezuela. This is crazy. I don't know why President Trump is even mentioning that. And he asked me, why? Why do you think that? And I'll tell you why. First, Venezuela is not Panama. Venezuela is not Grenada. Venezuela is a big country. You have more than 150,000 militias armed with AK-47s. This will become a second Vietnam. Third, you might come in with your special forces and take out Maduro, take him away like you did with Noriega, but that will never be forgotten in Venezuela or in the rest of Latin America. And the scars that you will leave will take generations to heal in the U.S.-Latin American relations. And last but not least, the Colombians will be accused of accomplices of this invasion or of this intervention, and the relations we have with the Venezuelans, with a country with 220,000 kilometers of live border, will be very difficult to manage. And he said, okay, I understand. And we did the press conference, and I said exactly what I'm telling you in the press conference. So that's the situation. I think the military intervention is very, completely crazy and counterproductive. And we are also trying to avoid implosion of the Venezuelan situation, which is not in our hands. An implosion would create violence, and violence would create much more migrants to Colombia. We have 2 million today, and if there's violence in Colombia, in Venezuela, we could have 4 or 5 million in 1 month or in 15 days. And that would create tremendous problems for Colombia. So that's why we pray so much for a rapid, peaceful transition.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to thank you again for being here. It's really, I know, inspirational to many of the students to hear both your story and Valentin's story. So I hope this question is one that maybe, Valentín, you can weigh on in your capacity as the Secretary of Planning, is that right? So the Colombian peace process has been hailed as an international example of women's involvement, and that's a voice that we haven't heard a lot about during these conversations. Can you talk about your administration's efforts to include women in the peace process, and what role women will play in the implementation process, particularly, as you've said, a lot of the peace building will have to go on within the country?
Well, this is the first peace agreement where the victims are the center of the solution, and their rights. The rights are stipulated in the Statute of Rome, which is an international treaty that was negotiated precisely to facilitate peace agreements. Which are those rights? The rights to the truth, the rights to reparations, the rights to justice, and the right to non-repetition. That was the core of the negotiation. Around those rights, we established the transitional justice system, we established a truth commission, we established a special unit to look for the disappeared people. Among that new approach of putting the victims, because usually the victims are ignored in armed conflicts, and they have been ignored for centuries. Who are the more victims of the victims? The women. they are the ones who suffer more in these wars, much more than men. So we included, for the first time also, a gender chapter, giving the women a sort of a prerogative, affirmative action in the implementation of the process, and their role in the implementation. And this is something unique. The women are playing a tremendous role. For example, this is also unique for the Colombian peace process. We negotiated special development plans for 18 different regions in Colombia, where the plans will be designed and constructed not as usual from the top down, but from the bottom up, asking the communities, asking the people who suffered the most to prioritize the investments in these 18 regions. There were 150 municipalities. It was a very beautiful and difficult democratic exercise. Who represents the communities? And everybody said, I. And the FARC wanted to say, no, I represent the community. No. And then the role of the woman in that discussion, in those discussions of who represented the communities, and then what did the communities want in each plan. It was a marvelous exercise where the most important voices were the voices of the women. And that is going on right now. The government is starting to implement these plans. We negotiated that during 2 years we would construct the plans, and the following 13 years we would implement. So we gave ourselves 15 years to put the plans in motion and comply with the agreement.
And from my perspective as the Secretary of Planning of one of the Colombian departamentos, states, provinces, Caldas, I can tell you that we have been doing a very thorough exercise going around the 27 towns in Caldas for the construction of our 4-year development plan. And we're going to have a special chapter on women because we were affected by the conflict as well. And we are in this period of reconstruction and reconciliation, and women are a key component in that process because there is a lot of single mothers that lost their husbands in the conflict. And I remember especially this tiny town called El Congal in Caldas, where just now we are starting to rebuild some of the houses and to work with the communities on women empowerment issues so that they are part of the solution. And I'll take this opportunity to encourage all the students at St. Ben's and St. John's to consider Caldas as a future internship opportunity and destination. And hopefully this will be the beginning of a good partnership between Collegeville, St. Joe, St. Ben, St. John's, and the people of Caldas.
All right, we would now like to invite you if you have questions, and I know many of you do. We do want to have them on the microphone, so maybe Quinlan's going to help me out here and walk around. So a few questions. Let's start with Cindy.
Thank you, Quinlan. Hi, thank you both for being here. My question's along climate change, because I know that's something near and dear to your heart and hopefully to all of ours. But how would you encourage countries like Colombia to pressure countries like the United States to take our climate crisis seriously?
To what?
To take the climate crisis more seriously.
That's what I do all day. Well, how do you pressure somebody at the top to change his mind? By putting pressure. And a politician feels the pressure when his electorate or the people start talking about whatever issue. In this case, climate change. Fortunately, what I've been seeing around the world is that the threshold or the level of sensitivity is going up. Young people are more and more interested, aware, and the more you explain to the people what climate change is, the more they are convinced that they have to do something. This transition from understanding and doing something is a very important one. That's where the leaders come in and motivate people to take the step to do something. And this is going around, this is going on all around the world. And you simply have to continue to press on that issue. I would say that some countries should have the courage to start playing harder. What do I mean by that? For example, the commercial transactions in normal trade, the United States for many, many years, and the European countries for many, many years, to accept the products from the rest of the world, they made they set some conditions. Or labor, the labor conditions in the country that was manufacturing the goods, or environmental conditions. Now the world is changing. I think the world should demand from the United States, from Brazil, and from the countries that don't believe in climate change, you want trade with me? You be responsible with your environment because that affects me also. And actions of that type, to make them more visible and more that people can feel it, will certainly trigger a change in attitude of many people who are today passive.
Okay, who's next? Mari.
Again, thank you both for being here. And President Santos, I'm just wondering, you said yesterday that making peace is much more difficult than making war. Have you always been such a strong advocate for peace, or did you undergo an experience that made you have a change of heart?
Well, I must say that not since I was born, no. When I was born in a country at war, as you saw, and I come from a very privileged family, and I was not conscious of the need for peace until very later in my life, and suddenly I sort of crossed the dots on many of my experiences where I said, listen, if I want to leave my children, my sons, my daughters, my grandchildren, and the sons and daughters of every Colombian a better country, I must work for peace. But I must work for peace strategically. This is a advice that I give to all of you. It's a bit of a military approach, but have clear strategic goals, but be flexible in the tactics to achieve those goals. The tactics are the short-term actions to achieve a long-term goal. In the short-term actions, the tactics, you have to be flexible. And this is an irony. I had to make war in order to achieve peace. And it's an irony. Questions like the one you ask, people say, well, this guy is really strange. You know, he was a war hero, and now he's a peacemaker. That is quite a contradiction. No, it's not a contradiction. It's being pragmatic, it's having flexible tactics, but the strategic goal was always there.
George.
Hello. First of all, thank you for being here. I've really appreciated your lecture last night. Yesterday you mentioned that you attended Catholic school and your connections to Pope Francis. How has your experience with Catholicism shaped your governance?
With what?
With your time governing that way?
Well, I come from Catholic family, of course. The church has been very important in Colombia, politically. We have not always been in agreement with what the church has defended. The church was very conservative, and it suddenly started to change in Colombia. And but they were always good and necessary allies in the causes where we had common denominators, the state and the church. We lived in Colombia an experience very different from the United States, because you, since your independence, the separation of church and state have been very clear, not in Colombia. The church almost dominated the state for many years, and that created a problem for many people in the relations between church and state. And therefore, we started to separate it effectively, and I think that that is a much better situation to have. The church does its work and fulfills its objectives, and the state does its work independently and fulfills its objectives. And when you can work together, for example, in all this social work, where the church can help the state or the state can help the church, this has been the good way to go about it. There was a big discussion, still is, this is still going on. In Colombia, much of the education was in the hands of the church. And the church was good educating the Colombians. But some people say this is not healthy. We need to separate the education from the church, and this is a struggle that is still going on today. I think, because of my own experience, that in many situations the church should be allowed to fulfill the role of the state to educate, because they're good at it. And in many places in Colombia, it's the only institution that can give a good education. Others say, no, this goes against the principles of the separation of church and state. It's a discussion we're still having. But in my experience, I always wanted to have good relations with the cardinals. It's better to have good relations with cardinals than to have them on the other side.
All right. Yes. Oh, yeah. And then, Annalee, I see you.
Thank you. President, I was very struck last night in the documentary of when you were elected. The first place you went was to the mountains and to the 4 tribes and nations of the La Sierras. And And then as you and Valentín spoke afterwards, you spoke about the importance of that encounter. And in the lecture today, you talked about your two philosophical concepts that were important to you, that of the mind and that of the heart. But you also told us that you were given back the stick to understand the spiritual context of the Mother Earth and in terms of work and climate change. And I would love if you would take a minute just to reflect on the importance of this spiritual component, which really becomes the three legs I see of the work that you're doing, that of the heart, that of the mind, but also now the spiritual component, which I find different than religion.
Right. Well, as I think I told you last night, I had an experience, marvelous experience, with this indigenous community, the oldest and I would say most original, the ones that still maintain the pre-Hispanic culture of all the indigenous communities in the Americas. These are the ones that are in the Sierra Nevada of Santa Marta. And I ended up with my sons and my daughter and my wife in a fabulous conversation of them explaining to me their philosophy, what they thought about life and why Mother Nature was so important, and their concept of justice, the concept of their sacred sites, and it has to do with something called the cosmovision. They say that this place, the Sierra Nevada, which is a beautiful place, very rich in biodiversity, is the center of the world. And they are, in a way, guardians of Mother Nature. And since then, they started to tell me, you need to understand that Mother Nature is not something you can dominate. Mother Nature dominates you, and you must respect her. But humans, the traditional, your approach is to dominate Mother Nature. She will never allow you to dominate her. And they started to explain to me the wetlands. The wetlands are those spaces in Earth that the rivers use to rest when they want a resting place, because rivers have life. And I was hearing them, and the rivers have life, and the wetlands, why do you think, and they started mentioning a few places that are today inhabited, but when there's hard rains, everything is flooded. That's Mother Nature claiming back their territory. I said, okay. And I remember that I was just recently appointed Minister of Defense, and they said to me, we ask you one favor. Please tell your soldiers to respect our sacred sites. And I immediately realized that it was ignorance from the soldiers. They simply had no idea what sacred site meant or what were sacred sites. So I made a manual so that every soldier that went to this Sierra Nevada had to memorize of respecting the sacred sites. That established a sort of special relations with them. That's what then I went as president to ask for their permission to be inaugurated in the Congress. And I said to them, okay, I want your advice. When they gave me the stick, and they said, make peace, but make peace also with Mother Nature because she's very mad. But there was another phrase that was very important to me. He said, for you, development is having a bigger car, building roads, building high buildings, having a larger house. That's for you development. Please understand that for us, development is allowing us to maintain our culture, our ways of living, our beliefs, and respect Mother Nature. Development is respecting Mother Nature. When you see what is happening in the world, and the phrase that you will never, one of the big errors, mistakes that human beings have made is to try to consider themselves superior to Mother Nature. And they said, you are not. You might be at the same level, but never superior. Usually Mother Nature is superior. She's wiser. She knows more than what you know. So don't try to dominate her. And when you see what is happening, climate change and everything, how true it is. So the spiritual component of feeling that rivers have life, that trees have life, that Mother Nature has life, they say if you really want to respect her and protect her, you must have that spiritual connection with her. And I have learned to recognize that this is true more and more. And I thought this is a great lesson. And when they said the Sustainable Development Goals are lacking that spiritual component, I said, how true? And what I try in many of the meetings I have around the world is let's think about that. Let's think of Mother Nature as our equal, not as our slave. Because if you treat her as a slave, she will destroy you.
Okay, time is also our master, but we will have time for one last question. So, Annalie? No pressure.
All right. Thank you so much again for coming to our campus. It's an honor to have you. My question is regarding what you mentioned earlier. So you encourage the people of Colombia to accept and treat the people of Venezuela with respect. How do you think we can influence people here in our country, including people of power, to treat immigrants like my family from El Salvador and other Central American and South American countries that come here to this country looking for a better lifestyle? How can we influence people to treat them with respect and treat them how we treat others here?
Well, remember that last night I talked about a virtue that every leader, or I would say everybody should have, is to feel empathy, to be able to put yourself in the shoes of others, to respect differences, to treat others like human beings, and what even the Bible says, you should treat others as you would like others to treat yourself. If you have that attitude, then you're going to be much better off. Unfortunately, you find people with a different attitude. I am superior. My country first. My community first. The rest can go away and do whatever they want, but we are first. I am first. That will generate short-term applause. It will generate maybe a short-term popularity, but that, what it feeds is discrimination, hatred, and all those wrong sentiments that allows a community or a country or the world to prosper.
I also wanted to take this opportunity to really quickly ask President Santos about the role that mentors had in his life. I think that one of the keys to accomplishing any goal is being surrounded by people who are supportive of you guys, students, and people that can show you the way, in a way, when their experience has given them the knowledge and the wisdom necessary to influence your decision-making. Who were your mentors, and what can you recommend to the students of the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University to find their own mentors?
The mentors. Well, for example, one of my big mentors was somebody from where you're from, Manizales. He was the head of the Coffee Federation. I was very young, just graduated from KU, Rock Chalk. And remember, we won the Super Bowl, right? Okay. He almost adopted me. He was like my second father, and started to teach me the art of negotiation. He was the very well-respected worldwide person. He was a poet who ran the Coffee Federation. He was a very humble person, and he started to teach me things that I had not been taught in the university. You know, the art of negotiation. He was the first one to say, put yourself in the shoes of the counterpart of these other countries, understand that they have a boss that is pressing them to achieve this or that. So don't be stubborn, talk to them and find a compromise. And he also taught me by his example. He never said it because those type of people never say it, but they express it with their example. He was the most powerful person after the president in Colombia, and he was the most humble person. So low profile, never shouted to anybody. It was the example, and that for me was an extremely useful experience that he had. So he was one of the important mentors that I had. I remember many professors that in some way or another had a big influence. Well, you always, or not always, but usually you have your father as a mentor, and I had my father as a mentor. He was a fabulous person who taught me what I've mentioned today, often about the values and the principles, and also by his example and by what I saw with him and my mother in my house. That has a very powerful effect in your behavior in the long run. And no, the accumulation of experiences. Sometimes you find mentors without knowing them, by reading about them. I read a lot of biographies, and I sort of internalize the life of somebody in a situation that I might experience, and that helps me in my attitude. So it's an accumulation of experiences that form your character and form your behavior and your way of life.
So let's not forget to read President Santos' book, The Battle for Peace, who will be coming to Minnesota in English sometime soon, we hope. And it's in its 5th edition in Colombia, best-selling book in Colombia last year. And I think that it's a great example for how we can make decisions in a dispassionate way and in a very being thorough with our thinking process. So thank you, President
And
Santos.
I must make something clear. Valentín has not asked for royalties.
Well, thank you both.
But I have asked St. Ben, St. John's to keep letting me bring in Colombia to campus. So here we go.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry we had such a limited time for questions, but it's really been a great honor to have you on our campus. So thank you very much. And thank you to Valentín for being such a devoted supporter of St. Ben, St. John's. So thank you all.